Okay, so you guys are a small bunch, but we'll start, and if a few more people trickle in, so be it. For those of you that don't know me, I'm substituting for Chi today. My name is Grant Adams. I've been teaching here part-time for 8 years. It's kind of scary how that happened. This was actually the class I was originally hired to teach. So I taught it for the first time in the fall of 2007 in this room, and it's kind of evolved a bit since then. But I love the class. I love the subject matter. I bounced around and taught a bunch of other things along the way too, though the way funding is and what have you now, I'm teaching pretty consistently 2 classes. This class on the other section of it, and the 136 class, which is the 3D modeling class. They're actually both being renamed next semester. This one's going to be called Digital Tools for Designers, and what is now Digital Tools 2 is going to be Digital Tools for Architects. So there's different naming conventions, but it's 136. I'd love to have all of you come and visit me for 136. I think it's a good second class, though you don't have to take it in any order, but I think it's a good place to go from here. So today Chi told me that you were working in InDesign. You were supposed to look through character palettes and paragraph palettes and kind of figure out how those worked. She asked if I would talk about typography and also kind of how to use the character palettes and that sort of thing. She also mentioned that you were working on your portfolios, I believe. Does that sound correct? No? Maybe not? Well, for some reason, she asked me to bring all the student portfolios today that I have, so I brought them so you can look at them. I don't know. I'll reread her email. Maybe this is something that's coming that you don't know about, but we'll have a look at those anyway because she asked me to. So, are you guys? What are you working on? Are you doing a poster?
I have no idea. We have different.
No, I'm not picking on you. I'm just looking randomly.
Yeah, I know. It's normally she has some sort of lab write-up that's posted on D2L, and we kind of go through it, and then there's a lab assignment at the end of it.
Okay.
And
do you have a current one, or is there not anything for today?
There is a current one. It's the typography.
Okay, so the fact that I'm talking about typography is a good thing. We got there. That's on. And so is it, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar. She didn't give me a copy of it. Is it the Vitruvius one? Is that where you're taking his text and working through a layout and that sort of thing, maybe?
We already did. That we submitted.
You already did that? Okay.
Already.
Well, you will have to.
This is after that.
You will have to show me whatever we're doing, and we'll go with whatever it is, okay? But in the meantime, we're going to talk about typography, and I do have portfolios because I'm guessing at the end you're probably going to do a portfolio. So since I'm here, you might as well look at those too. So let's talk about typography. This is a little out of order for where I do it, so I just took my typography lesson and we're going to stick it in. And I don't know whether it works or it doesn't work with what you've already learned, but we're going to go with it. So we need to start with a definition of terms so that we have a common ground to talk about when we start talking about type. And if I start talking about what's a serif, what's a sans serif, you at least know what I'm talking about. Okay? So let's first talk about style. And this is not something that you're unfamiliar with. You probably are very familiar with it because it's kind of one of those basic things you learn in Word to do. Basically, it means, do you have the font as just a regular font? Do you have it as a bold? Do you have it as an italic? Okay? Those are kind of common things that you might use through the course of your English papers or what have you. Usually they're used to provide some kind of contrast or emphasis. You might bold a title, you might italicize some quotation or something like that. The thing about it is your computer has 2 different ways of applying these. Built into, let's pick on Word for right now. Inside Word, you can go to the Edit menu and you could say, select this text and then make it bold. Right? You guys have done that before, I'm assuming. Okay? What that's doing is the software, Word, and or your operating system is saying, okay, here's the text, fatten it up a little bit. Or here's the text, slant it over a little bit. Right? It's not anything special, it just says, give it a little bit more weight. A lot of times, the higher end fonts, the ones that are designed by professionals, will have different fonts. And you may have seen this on a computer as well, where you have like a Garamond font, and then you have Garamond Italic and Garamond Bold, and you can pick from those within the font menu. Those italicized versions, or those bold versions, are designed by the font designer themselves. So the italics all go together. They're not just a slanted version of the regular text. So if you can pick, from the list that has multiple fonts that are designed by the designer. They're going to be better quality type than if you just say edit bold. Okay, so it's important to kind of recognize that because a lot of people don't realize that there's a difference. Weight refers to the relative lightness or darkness of the letter forms. So how thick are the letters, so to speak? How heavy do they feel? They're marked by changes in stroke, which is also line width. You guys have already done Illustrator, so you're familiar with stroke width. Same thing happens in the world of fonts. You have a stroke width. We have a light font, we have a medium font, we have a bold font. Those are thicknesses of the letters themselves. Width refers to different variations within a typeface family. You can have a condensed font, you can have a compressed font, and you can have an extended font. Just means are you squishing it together. You've probably played around with these in your English class when you needed to make your paper a little bit longer. When you said, let me go to the extended font, right, and make it look a little longer, right? So that's where those come into play. X height refers to the height of lowercase letters without ascenders or descenders, right? Without things sticking out. So the easiest way to think of it, no surprise it's called an X, is what's the height of the X, right? And that has to do with the height of the lowercase letters. And depending on what font you're picking, you're going to get different X heights, and it's going to look different. And you probably experienced this, you just didn't know what it was called. Cap height is the height of a capital letter. And so I think the easiest way to kind of see this is to look at this graphic. So we have a full capital, right, that goes all the way up to its cap height. We have a small capital, which is the same size as an X height. Okay, we'll talk about that in a second. We have a regular letter here, right? Then we have a letter that has an ascender, and we have a letter that has a descender below those baselines. So the X height is right here. And it's too bad they picked an A instead of an X, but you get the idea. Counters are the white space that's located in and around the letter forms. And so it's not that big of a deal in normal fonts, but if you're using a font for a title or for a cover or something like that, an architectural poster, something really big, this starts to matter. It can affect the legibility or the readability of that particular piece. If it's a thin font at a large size, it's going to have a very open counter. There's a lot of space around it. It kind of has to do with positive and negative space. And if it has too much of that space around it, it can be harder to read. Likewise, if you have a really small font and it's bold, everything gets squished together and it's harder to read. So a lot of typeface selection and a lot of typeface design is all about how readable is this particular thing that you're trying to create. And so you want to pay a lot of attention to that. Small capitals, which you saw in that graphic before, are basically small capital letters that are the height of an X height. They're used when you need an acronym or you need some capital letters, but you don't want to provide too much emphasis. If you use big, tall capital letters as an acronym and you're writing in an English paper or a history paper, it's going to stand out every time you use it. Where if you use the small capitals, it's not going to stand out quite so much. Right? Lining and non-lining figures. Figures you can substitute for numbers. Right? In the world of typography, it's called figures, not numbers, but that's what we're talking about here. Lining figures are a set of numbers with the same width and height as a full capital letter. Non-lining figures have the height of an X height, and they have ascenders or descenders. So if we look at them here, lining figures over here on the left, full height, right? Non-lining figures are the height of an X height, but if you get to a 3, they're going to have a descender below it. And you've probably seen this in fonts before. Some of them have it that are non-lining, some of them have them that are lining. The advantage here is just like with the small capital letters, if you're using numbers in the middle of text, they don't stand out, right? If you use non-lining figures. If you use lining figures, they're going to stand out a little bit more. A lot of times when you're writing your history paper or something, you'll write out the whole number because you don't want to provide too much emphasis by using actual numbers.
Sorry, just to clarify,
Yeah.
It's only descenders? They don't go, there's no ascenders?
6 would go an
Okay.
ascender. So, if we had, are there even any markers in this room? Right, if we had our X height there, that's our X height, right? Just like with the letters, right, we'd have a G that would go below, a 3 goes below, a 6 goes above, right? A 9 goes below. You get the idea. So there are both. So ligatures are specially designed characters produced when you combine letters together, and they're intentionally done by the font designer for collisions, right? And this is something you naturally do when you write, right? So if I was writing something with 2 T's in it, right, cursive is
more common that way. But even if I was writing it this way, I would generally cross the two T's together, right? Same thing happens if I was doing two F's, right? I would generally cross the F's together. If I didn't do it that way and I did a separate piece, sometimes I have weird combinations. T is really hard too, because it's hard to even draw it without crossing them both. So what a font designer will do is they'll take these common letters and they'll start to combine them together. So the I is a really good example, right? You get this really ugly collision between the top of the F and the I, right? The top of the F extends out and becomes the top of the I, right? You do a lot of things naturally. So a good font, a well-designed font, is going to have all these ligatures built in, and you won't ever have to actually do the substitution. It just looks for these patterns of characters. If you have two F's together, it'll just automatically substitute in that character. Not something you have to worry about, but it shows the difference between a good font and a not-so-good font in terms of how it's been built. So how do we go about choosing the right font? And this is another big challenge. You want to think about how long do you want this piece to last? Can it be, is it allowed to be something that's trendy, right? What's the purpose of this piece? What are you trying to convey? Is the font correct? If you're doing a poster on modern architecture, you probably should pick a sans serif font that's a very modernist style font, right? A Helvetica or something along those lines. You want to make sure it matches with your general piece, okay? Is it innovative? Is it going to be outdated? That sort of thing. Is it traditional? Is it too conservative? Like, are you using Times New Roman, which is really ugly, but that tends to be what English professors like. I like to pick on English professors. Anyway, I think the best example of this, and some of you are probably even too young to, I'm dating myself, right? So maybe you remember when The Lord of the Rings came out, right? When The Lord of the Rings came out, they started using this font that was called Papyrus, right? And they used it in the movies. And it was like, oh my God, it's really cool. And then everybody started using it. You went to a restaurant and they printed their menu in Papyrus. Like, it was just like this common font. It was everywhere, right? Now, if we look back on it, you're like, oh my God, that is so 2000. It's so dated, right? And so what happens is it got overused and people didn't like it so much. And so now you use it and it looks dated, right? Or if you had a piece where you used it, like go back and watch The Lord of the Rings and you look at it and you're like, wow, that's a dated font, right? So maybe it takes a little bit of extra appreciation. Maybe the normal person wouldn't necessarily say, oh, that's a really ugly font. But if you're in the world of design, you're always going to have that over your head. It's always going to be either ugly or, wow, that's a really good font, right? Because you're going to think of that. So that's a good example of why typeface selection is important. Really, the easiest way to do this is to compare versions side by side with different fonts to see what's right. Does it have the right readability? Does it evoke the correct emotion that you're going after? Is it legible enough? Right? Does it reflect the needs of the client and or the viewer of this particular piece? So depending on what it is that you're designing, you want to design pick your font accordingly. So this is a pretty good example. I like this, the periodic table of typefaces. We start with kind of the very basic sans serif clean fonts. We move down into the serif fonts as we get a little bit lower, and then we get into the Old English style fonts with lots of character to them. And then the script fonts are down below. So it's kind of a fun way of doing it. The other graphic that I have, this one's great. You will never be able to read this on the projector, but I would encourage you to go to the website. I'll show you this later on. And you can actually follow through it and read this, but it's really fun. You look at something, do I even have a mouse? Can I point on this? No. This is like, basically you say, so I need a typeface, I'm doing an invitation, and then it asks you a question. You say yes or no, and you kind of chain through, and then you find what font you should pick. It's kind of fun. Anyway, it doesn't do a whole lot because you can't read it, right? The projector in 103, you can actually read it. So then you get to the world of combining typefaces. So obviously, if you stuck with a single typeface, it's always going to go together, which is nice. If you're within a single font family, you can pick the bold version, you can pick the italic version, and you can have some variety. At the same time, when you combine multiple fonts together, a lot of times you can get very extended possibilities. But how do you pick which fonts go together? Generally, you're going to pick not two sans serif fonts or not two serif fonts. You're going to pick one and the other. So you want a serif font and a sans serif font.
Can you explain what the difference is between
Sure.
the two?
So this is actually a good side to see it. So these two, right? This is a serif font and this is a sans serif font. The difference are these little tails. See how that
Okay,
S
so
extends down? the top of the B has a little tail on it, the A has a little tail on it, right? If we look at the T, it's flat here. So serif doesn't have any little characters, right? And this is generally a cleaner, more modern look. This with the tails on it, Times New Roman, that kind of thing, is much easier to read than this is in large blocks of text. And so if you were doing, say, a poster or something, you might take something like this to do the heading, something that's big, heading, that sort of thing. But if you were doing a big body of text, you might pick Meridian here, which is much easier to read. And there's a reason that your English professors say, give it to me in Times New Roman, because it's easier to read, right? There's no surprise that it's called Times. Newspapers use it, magazines use it. If you go to any magazine and you open it up, it's going to be a serif font, right? Any of the small stuff, because you need to be able to read it. Small characters, easier to read. Okay? So when we're combining the typefaces together, you want to pick two opposing types. Okay? But you also want to make sure they have similar X heights. So you compare the X heights to make sure they go together. The truth is, the easiest way to pick two that go together is to Google it, right? What font pairs nicely with whatever? So pick one and then Google the other one. And it'll give you a pretty good result, and you have two that will work very, very nicely together. The other types of typefaces that exist are typefaces that are display and or script fonts. And these are not something where you would write the whole English paper in it, right? But you might use it for a title. You might use it for a headline. If you were doing a lecture series poster, it might be the big lecture series, talking about that kind of information. Script typefaces are the same kind of thing. Generally, they're overused for invitations and something where it needs to be fancy, right? And if you ever get a wedding invitation and you look at it and you go, "Who's getting married?" Because it's much harder to read. So it takes extra concentration to figure out how to read a script font, which is why you wouldn't turn in your history paper to Daniel written in a script font, because he'd give it back to you and say, "I'm not reading this," right? So just some examples along the way of different typefaces and how they come together. So if we talk about designing with type, we really want to focus on legibility and readability. Okay, and this is essential for any kind of successful communication of a particular piece. And we're speaking specifically graphic design realm right now, but it certainly applies when you're doing your big architectural presentation board or what have you. Legibility is the recognition of the individual letter forms, so the recognition of letters, right, and their relative position to other letters, right? Readability is, can we actually read the paragraph? Does the line allow us to read it? Are they too squished together, right? How readable is it, right? So we have legibility, which is the individual letters, and then readability is how it flows and can I actually read through it. All right? Objective representation is practical, straightforward, clear, ordered presentation of information, hierarchy established, that sort of thing, right? Subjective representation is kind of the free flow. It's the conceptual, interpretive. Things don't necessarily have the hierarchy. It's more artistic. Doesn't work as well for large bodies of text, obviously, but it works pretty well for titles and that sort of thing, right? You want to focus on both macro and micro perspectives when it comes to typography. The overall design layout is a macro perspective thing. How does the type fit into the overall page? This would be like selecting the right font, right? Big picture stuff. Is the composition the way it should look, right? Does the text fill up the right amount of the page? That kind of thing. Does it contain some kind of typographic hierarchy? Are there larger fonts and then smaller fonts, right? Do we understand what headings are, what's a heading, what's a subheading, and what's the body of this particular piece of text? And obviously the placement of the elements around it obviously play into that as well. Micro perspectives is the very small details. And the interesting thing about this is that it applies certainly in the world of typography. We want to think about the overall piece and then how do the letters combine? Is there enough space between individual letters? And I'll show you some examples later on. But it works really well at the architectural scale as well. So if I was designing a building, the best designers out there can look at the overall building. What does the building form look like? How does it feel? How does it feel to be in that building? All the way down to the very small detail of how does this corner come together? How does the flashing work? How does the rain get separated from this roof to that roof, right? It's the little details matter just as much as the big details. And so you as a designer have to learn to shift those perspectives. So the micro and the macro perspectives are critical. This is a good example of hierarchy. It's not even in a language that I can read, but at the same time I have a pretty good sense of this hierarchy and how the text combines together.
And I think it's a really beautiful way of how the text comes together. All one font, right? But they're using the small caps in the middle of it, which gives us not too much emphasis on that word, whatever it means, right? A little bit bolder font here, right? The little dotted lines, just really nicely done. Symmetry and asymmetry shouldn't be a big surprise. You've probably talked about this in the world of graphic design before. Symmetrical is going to be balance and harmony, right? Asymmetrical is going to be this weird thing that's floating off to one side, but it creates a lot of interest. It's diverse. It's activity. It's motion. It's something that draws your attention. So you can really work with those two as a juxtaposition. Alignment is the horizontal and vertical position of the typography within the margins. Right? Is it left justified? Is it right justified? Where does the text line up? Right? Those matter. Is it centered? Those kinds of things. Alignment is going to create the visual relationships between the various elements of the design. Some more examples. Typographic color doesn't matter so much at the small scale in the portfolio or something like that because you're right on top of it. But anytime you're looking at something like a poster or a presentation board or something like that, you want to think about typographic color. And that is, if you squint at the paragraph, how dark or light is that paragraph? And if you squint at this, there's certain paragraphs that jump out, right? And there's other ones that go away, right? This one jumps out, right? This one's a bit darker. This one's a bit darker. And so it has to do with the density of the paragraph, obviously the font has to do a lot, but we can look at that as an element of the graphic design. How dark, how light is it in context with the rest of the graphic design? It starts to really matter. It's certainly something you want to think about. Type size is usually measured in points. You've picked a 12-point font. You've picked a 13-point font because you needed a couple extra pages in your English paper, right? You're familiar with that. The changes in the type size result in a nice hierarchy of elements. So if you need a heading, a lot of times you can take the same font, just make it a little bit bigger, and that'll work really nicely. Ideally, you'll develop a proportionate set of sizes. So maybe a 14-point font is the heading, a 12-point font is the subheading, and a 10-point font is the body of the text. Right? So there's a set increment that you've changed. You've established that. Case is also something that's important. Do you use lowercase letters? Generally, lowercase letters are going to be more readable than uppercase letters. Uppercase letters emphasize the individual letters, and you have to go through as you read them, right, with each individual letter to kind of understand what's going on. Our brains are really interesting because our brains actually have memorized certain word patterns. And so, for example, it doesn't matter what order the letters in a word appear, right? The only important thing is that the first and last letter are in the right place, which is very true. As long as the first and last letters are in the right place, our brains kind of interpret what a word looks like, and therefore we can read it relatively easily. The first little bit of this sentence is a little bit hard, but then you get right into the flow of it and you can read it without a problem. If, however, I change and I write this in uppercase, it takes a lot longer and a lot more attention to read this because you have to concentrate on the letters, because there's no longer a form of the word. Each word is a big rectangular box, and you have to concentrate on the individual letters. So this is the best way that I know of to emphasize the difference between uppercase letters and lowercase letters, right, and how they affect readability. Kerning adjusts the spacing between individual letters. So this is very much a micro-perspective thing. Generally not something you're going to do for a big paragraph, but something you want to do in a title, right, in a heading. And it's the spacing between the individual letters. It's used to correct collisions and or get rid of unwanted spaces. And it allows it to read smoothly. T and Y are a particularly good example, right? So the default spacing, the Y is going to start right after the T. If we were writing it by hand, right, and we were writing TY, we would of course write the T and put the Y underneath the top of the T. That's just natural. Okay? Same thing happens here. By default on a computer though, right, the Y is going to occur after the T ends, and it's not going to look right. So we tuck the Y underneath, and now it looks correct. Right? And again, this only matters in titles and that sort of thing. Right? When we come down here, right, this is the default spacing, very, very close here, right? A little bit further here, a little bit more space here. So we make adjustments so that it feels like the letters are evenly spaced. They're not actually evenly spaced. If I were to measure this distance to this distance, it's more, but it has to do with how the letter forms work.
right? So you have to kind of play around with what looks right, yeah.
So is this a feature in editing as well, or is it built into the type?
This is something that you have to do.
Okay.
That's why I'm saying it's something that you're going to do only at the heading level, right, or subheading. You're not going to mess with it in the body of your particular text. The ones to really focus on, TY, VA, Y, I, right, things like that. 1-1 is always going to be a little bit wider apart, right? 1-9 are also a little bit iffy. Tracking adjusts the spacing between words, lines, and paragraphs, right? So instead of making your font bigger to make your paper look longer, right, you would adjust the tracking so that it just a little bit more space in between the words. See, I'm giving you tips for your history papers, right? So the tracking doesn't change the font size. It doesn't extend the font. It just gives a little bit more space in between, and it can greatly improve the readability of a particular piece. Right, a little bit more space between the words makes it easier for your brain to recognize those individual words as you're flying through a paragraph. Okay. It also influences typographic color. If you space the words out a little bit more, the color drops away. It's not quite so black. You don't want to track lowercase letters. Okay. Leading, right, is the space between lines of text, and the way Word unfortunately screwed us all up because Word calls it single spaced and double spaced. Right. It's not really correct. It has to do with the spacing in between is actually called leading, and it should be given in terms of points. And so generally, right, a single-spaced document, a Word's single-spaced document, is going to be somewhere along the lines of maybe 1.2 times the font. Okay, the point size of the font. So if you have a 12-point font, it's going to be like 14, 15, something like that, to give you that single space. Right? If you want double that, you increase that point size, and it's giving you the space in between the various lines of text, right? So if you have a sans serif font, right, so something without those little tails on it, you need more leading. You need more space between the paragraphs to make it readable, right? If you have a serif font, Times, you're doing a magazine, you can squish the lines together and you can still discern the individual characters.
It's measured from bottom to bottom, or bottom
You
to
know,
top of the X.
I think it's bottom to bottom, but it would be worth it to double check. It should be bottom to bottom because that would make single spacing about right. Right. So it's bottom to bottom, I think. It might be top to top. I don't know. That's a good question. I'll have to look into it. So I'll end with just a quick little piece of a portfolio that has a lot of text in it because I think it's a good combination of all these pieces. This is a timeline piece. It's kind of blurry, so it's hard to see. Let's go to the next page. Here's a good combination. You've got the photos and the stuff going on. I have no idea what this is even about, right? But there's a quote, and it's written in all capitals, so you have to focus on it and really read it. At the same time, there's additional information up here that's much smaller, right? Can be written in a smaller font, and it's still very legible. Okay, does that kind of make sense how they're changing it? You wouldn't write the stuff up there in the all capital letters. It is very consistent page to page to page. Another quote here, all capitals, you've got to concentrate on it. So they're using the principles of type to really try to identify, how to make your particular piece better. So type is equally as important to anything else you put in a portfolio or anything else you put on a poster, right? You really want to think about that stuff. Another example, different page, but it still shows, right? We have the large, you can barely see it. It says vision right there in all capital letters, right? Then we have paragraphs that are easier to read, a space, and then a small little piece here that describes probably about whatever's going on in that particular image. Okay, so that was the typography lecture. I'm going to move into the world of InDesign, and we're going to try to talk through some of the stuff that I think you're doing in InDesign. Though it might not hurt for me to take a quick break and look at your whatever your assignment is, so that I can try to gear whatever you're supposed to be doing with what I'm going to talk about. So.